all of those presentations on the touch screen of the ballot marking device are not the ballot. And therefore, questions about the legal right of the voter to be able to verify the correctness of their ballot before it's put in the ballot box, that question applies to the piece of paper, and that all of the offers that the machine makes to allow you to correct your mistakes before the ballot is printed are merely good and well-intentioned conveniences from the machine. And I won't disagree that they belong there, but in the legal definition of what is a ballot is that piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
There's been confusion about that for years, and the reason is that on mechanical lever voting machines and then on direct recording electronic voting machines, the display of the candidate choices on the face of the machine, the paper behind the levers or the computer screen that was on the direct recording voting machine, that has been legally defined as a ballot, quite distinct from the piece of paper that you put your votes on. And then things got confused even more by direct recording electronic voting machines with paper trail, where that paper trail, well, does it have the status of a ballot or not? Well, if it's not tabulated, it's not the ballot. And one way of describing those direct recording machines is that they're really ballotless machines. There is no physical record of any vote cast. There is just the electronic record or the mechanical record inside the machine in the settings of the little registers that count. And so this whole definition of ballot is a problem, and the judge does seem to have narrowed that definition down in the end, but I don't think he took the time to follow through on the consequences of that ruling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the
What do you mean by that?
Well, if the law says that the voter must be able to verify their ballot,
Mm-hmm.
And the ballot is defined as that piece of paper, and that ballot contains two chunks of print. One chunk of print is a bunch of barcodes that I can't make heads or tails of, and the other chunk of print is the names of the candidates I voted for. Is it adequate that I can verify the names that are printed in Roman letters on paper? Or must I be able to verify the entire ballot, including the part that's counted, the part with all those barcodes in it, which is the only thing the tabulating machine counts? And I don't think he followed through on the consequences of that. And I also don't completely understand the rules Arkansas has for what constitutes a misruling enough and egregious and a bad enough fault on the part of the judge to be overturnable on appeal. I mean, does it have to be overturned on a procedural issue, or can he be overturned on questions of fact? And I don't know.
I don't either.
I'm not a lawyer.
I'm not either. But I do know this.
Yeah.
I do know that I can't read barcode, and that is what is being counted.
Yeah. I will mention that ES&S has a handout, a one-page handout on how votes are counted. And that handout includes a little part across the bottom, a decoder chart for barcodes. It allows you to decode barcodes. And it explains that the barcodes on the ballot give you the latitude and longitude of the bubble on the paper ballot where you would cast the corresponding vote. But is that paper ballot something you have with you in the voting booth while you're verifying your ballot? If it were posted on the booth, maybe. But that's even worse than the old Votomatic voting machine, where we know that people didn't verify their votes and made big mistakes in their votes. And it was in principle verifiable, but in fact impractical to verify. And I think that's where we are with the barcodes, that there is this bizarre theory that someone could in principle verify them if they had this handout from ES&S with them, and if they had a copy of the paper ballot with them.
I'll be honest with you, I couldn't follow his logic. I could not follow his logic, and so I'm not alone.
Okay.
Dr. Stark couldn't follow his logic either. Now that anybody else that I spoke with could follow
No,
what he was trying to say.
I think he had prejudged the case before the hearing, and I think that part of his prejudging was correct in trying to throw out this whole volume of stuff about how the machine works, and hackability really doesn't play into the argument about verifiability.
Mhm.
And what confused me, in fact, the thing I think his biggest logical error, after throwing out all these arguments about how the machine works, he said that you had to prove that there had been a case in Arkansas where a machine had been hacked before you could worry about whether the barcodes were verifiable. And that's just wrong. It's like worrying about whether like saying you have to wait until a horse is stolen before you worry about whether it's appropriate to lock the barn door. And I, it's a classic bit of wisdom.
Right.
Lock the barn door. Don't wait until a horse disappears.
Well, like I say, somebody may be taking it out at night, riding it, bringing it back. You don't know. There's all kinds of things that can happen.
Gosh. Yeah. And in elections, we want people to be taking the voting machines home and playing with them. And honestly, I put it back. I didn't do any damage to it, but it was fun to play with.
Right. Well, like I said, I didn't follow his logic at all, and it was unfortunate. But he made his ruling. He did it quick. We were over there, an hour and a half?
Yep.
An hour and a half.
Yep.
And didn't even listen to our experts.
And in fact, he also surprised the state. The state had an expert that they said would be there in time for testimony after lunch, but so the state expected this to go on
right
into the day, and I think this is one where the judge surprised both sides.
He did. I think so. Well, let me ask you this question, since I got you here, and we're just kind of informal here. The machines and the computers that are inside them, can they be hacked?
Probably.
Okay.
I have no.
Not that there's evidence.
I've taught computer security, and the standard assumption we make in the world of computer security is that if it's got a computer in it, it can probably be hacked.
Right.
And don't bother me with it's not connected to the network, therefore it can't be hacked. Computers were networked. The most famous early computer viruses were on the Apple IIs. The Apple II had no provision for networking. More recently, Stuxnet was a computer virus that seems to have been invented either by the United States military or by Israeli military or by some consortium of the two. It was invented to attack the Iranian centrifuges in the Iranian nuclear efforts, and appears to have been used successfully in that role, but it escaped into the wild and new payloads have been added by criminal organizations. The most recent statistics I've seen on the prevalence of malware suggests that something like 20 to 40% of all personal computers are infected. And this is statistics that were gotten by buying in bulk disks from computer recyclers in India and scanning those disks. Mm-hmm. So when you recycle your old computer, there's a good chance that it ends up going to India to be disassembled and scrapped. And buying disks in bulk from those scrappers and scanning them for viruses shows that there are an awful lot of infected computers out there. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know about the voting machines, but my confidence level is low. I mean, Microsoft has actually made an occasional software release that came pre-infected from Microsoft because someone managed to get inside there. And they've done a better job recently. They've learned, but it took them a long time to learn that security matters. Until the early 2000s, Microsoft in the 1980s and 90s ignored security because it was your personal computer. Its security depends on whether you lock the door. It took them a long time to react to the existence of networks and to the threats networks pose. But there were computer security problems in the era of floppy disks. People were spreading viruses by floppy disk between Apple IIs.
We spread viruses by thumb drives.
Yeah,
and that goes in all these.
Well, machines. In fact, the thumb drive is the tool that Stuxnet was using to attack the centrifuges in Iran. Those were deliberately air-gapped from the internet, and it didn't work.
It didn't work. And so what we're trying to say is that there's not enough. We think that the paper ballot
Yeah.
that is hand marked, that is, you can run it through a scanner after that.
Yeah.
But we think that the voter intent, and of course I said 98%, but Dr. Stark corrected me. He said 99% of voter intent is captured by a paper ballot.
That's right. And there is a small fraction of voters who are blind, voters with physical disabilities that prevent them from holding a pen, who are going to need something like a ballot marking device to help them vote the ballot. But for the vast majority of us, the safest, most secure way to convey your intent to a voting system is by filling in an X or a bubble or a check or whatever it is on a paper ballot. And this is something that it's a broad consensus in the tech industry. I mean, the computer science community has been putting out press releases saying this for 20 years now.
Right.
And there are enthusiasts who believe otherwise. And I think a lot of people with money in it, particularly people with money in cryptocurrency, really want blockchain to be the solution to everything, and are trying to sell us that if only we use blockchain to do our laundry, our clothes would be cleaner.
Right.
But aside from that strange community of blockchain enthusiasts, it's very hard to find people who disagree with the idea that paper is the only secure voting method.
Blockchain, if it's a bad record, all it's doing is solidifying a bad record, right? So
that's right. That's right.
So it's like, hey, we have proof that this record is here. But
that's right.
A bad record.
That's right. I've had students who become blockchain junkies, and it's an interesting disease.
Right. Well, like I say, we believe that, like I say, you have a piece of paper and you mark it. Most people recognize that they've made a mistake. They realize that, I didn't mean to vote for him. I can't believe I did that.
Yeah, and you see it as you make the mistake.
Exactly.
The only real exception are when the paper ballots are badly designed. I mean, Florida for a while had some delightful things written into their standard procedures. They would have the bubble on one side of the candidate name and then the name going across the ballot. And then on the other side, parenthesis dem end paren, or parenthesis rep end paren, arranged in a neat column that looked like bubbles. And if your eyesight was like mine is in my growing old years, if you don't have your glasses on, that dem and rep in parentheses looks an awful lot like a bubble that you could fill in. Stupid ballot design.
Right.
Yeah, that's nice to mark the party of the person. So if I care about parties, I can pay attention to that. But don't make it look like the thing I should be filling in.
Mm-hmm.
And they also, another good example of a bad ballot design, also a Florida example from 2000. I looked at all the different optical mark sense ballot designs used in 44 Florida counties that used optical mark sense ballots in 2000. And I looked at all those ballots. There was a delightful one where on most races, the race is outlined on the ballot, and there's a column of bubbles and a column of candidates. And the instruction at top says, say, for Secretary of State, vote for one. But you get to for president, and someone thought vote for one was a funny term when you're voting for a president and a vice president. But they couldn't say vote for two. So they said, what was it? Vote for one team. And that's just confusing.
Right.
And then to add insult to injury, Florida had a rather easy ballot access laws. And so we had Democrats and Republicans and Green Party and Libertarian Party and the Socialist Workers Party and Communist Party of the United States and Communist Party and 11 parties total on the ballot. And it turned out if you print the ballot by putting the instructions in column one, you get to 9 candidates and you're out of column one. So you put another box of candidates at the top of column 2, and the software by default fills in vote for one team, vote for one team. And someone who thinks voting is an intelligence test and they have to follow the instructions precisely or their ballot will be disqualified sees a little box of candidates saying vote for one. Another little box of candidates saying vote for one. So they vote for 2.
Got
And no continued on next column, no continued from previous column. Obvious things to do if you're going to break a race across 2 columns of a ballot.
it. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the same problem with touchscreen machines where they have a screen full of candidates, and then you hit next and you get more candidates in the same race. You have to have at the bottom of the one group saying continued on next screen, and the bottom at the top of the other group continued from previous screen.
But even saying continued, you might just think, oh, I need to go to the next page.
Yeah. I mean,
So
basically,
splitting a race is just
splitting
bad
a
design.
race is bad design, and the problem is, well, we've got these blasted people who are into pretty typography or pretty web design, and their advice these days is put in lots of white space. And I'm sorry, if you put in so much white space that the race doesn't fit on my page or that the race doesn't fit on my screen, you're not doing me a favor.
Mm-hmm.
I've been having blasted times with this, with the quote instructional management systems that are popular today. I won't mention names, but they're really good on white space enough that when I'm trying to invent the answers to a quiz, the question is already scrolled off the page, and that's just not helpful.
But speaking of the page, we have so many races on one ballot.
Yeah.
You had an idea for how ballots should be, or elections should be broken apart.
Well, this is not my idea. It turns out if we've got a big world here, and there are a lot of countries, and there are a lot of creative people in different countries. Korea has a really interesting idea. Instead of having one piece of paper for the whole ballot with all the races on it, they have one piece of paper about the size of a dollar bill per race. And you've got multiple races, so they have multiple colors. So you get this handful of colorful ballot slips, and you vote each one in Korea, they do it with a rubber stamp. Rubber stamp in the circle by the candidate's name. And then you put all your ballots in an envelope and put it in the ballot box. And at the election headquarters, they open all the envelopes, stack up all the ballots, and run them through a currency sorting machine that sorts them by color. And it's the same kind of machine they could use to sort $10 bills from $5 bills, from $20 bills, from $50 bills, etc. Nice idea. And then you run the stack of ballots through the same machine, but it sorts by who it's voted for. And you end up with a stack of ballots voted the same way, and you can just riffle through it. And you can see the bubbles, all the same column of bubbles being rubber stamped. The rubber stamps will jittle a little bit, but if one bops over this way, as you're riffling through, there was a missort.
Because they would keep it in a left to right where the candidates are.
Yeah.
So if it's stamped all the way to the left and then all the other ones are in the middle,
Right.
You'd tell the difference.
You'd tell the difference if it's off by one candidate either way. And then, so you got a stack of ballots. The machine tells you how many were in the stack. But to check it, you put it in another currency sorting machine that riffles through it and counts them. The same kind of machines you'd see in a casino or a bank.
Right, you just put it, goes all the way through.
It's clever.
Yeah.
And
and then you have somebody looking through them,
it's
right?
extremely easy to audit because you end up with things in neat bundled stacks by how they were voted, where each stack you can easily record on the wrapper for the bundle how many ballots there are in it and who those are voted for. And that becomes the input to any audit process.
Mhm.
It's really clever. And don't underestimate the cleverness of people at making things really complicated either, because I mean the Norwegian voting system, they figured out how to have fractional votes.
Mhm.
There's one man, one vote.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good rule until you get to the point you discover that you're allowed to vote 2/3 of my vote for this party and 1/3 of my vote for that candidate.
Mhm.
And that need not be a candidate from the same party.
Wow.
Oh.
Oh yeah. We don't need that. We don't need that here.
Face it, people are really good at inventing crazy, stupid ways to do things. And we in the United States have made one of the most complicated election systems in the world by simply putting so many races on one ballot.
One election.
One election, yeah. We've said everyone's going to go to the polls on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November in an even numbered year, and we're going to vote on everything from dog catcher to president. And We've made life complicated for ourselves, but other people have found completely different ways to make life complicated. My favorite, quote, reform proposal, if you want a reform proposal to joke about, is to combine the Australian and the Dutch and the American voting systems. The Australian voting system is one where you have ranked choice voting. You must rank all of the candidates in order of your preference. If you make any mistakes in your ranking, your ballot is voided.
You can't skip anyone.
You can't skip. You can't declare a tie. You have to do, if there are 10 candidates, you have to number them from 1 to 10.
Okay.
Without mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The Dutch have decided to elect their legislature at large. So it's an 80 seat parliament. And so no party is allowed to run more than 40 candidates, and there were 22 parties on the ballot. And so the ballot had over 600 candidate names on it.
Unbelievable.
Sheet of paper the size of a newspaper in fine print with columns and columns and columns and columns of candidates. It was a vote for one election with the most remarkably complicated rules for selecting the winner. So if we did that in the United States, you'd put all of the candidates for Congress on one ballot, along with all the candidates for State House, and of course your governor and your presidential elections. You'd end up with a ballot the size of the Sunday New York Times. It would take you all day to vote, and the likelihood your ballot would be valid would be close to zero.
Wow.
So each reform proposal taken in isolation might look good, but if you combine them all, you get a monster.
Right. Well, talk to us about audits.
Okay.
Here in Arkansas, they say we do 100%, but we do audits, and they're 100% accurate.
Well, it turns out if you tell the auditors what the expected result is, they'll keep recounting the ballots by hand until they get the expected result.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the rules in an audit is that you shouldn't go into the audit knowing what you're expected to get. You should go into the audit and get whatever you get in your hand count, and then figure out the discrepancies. Mm-hmm. And, one of the hand counts are subject to clerical errors. One of the things I would expect in an audit is evidence of that fact. And the fact that when I've read 2 reports for statewide reports for election audits, and they, by and large, showed 0 errors, 100% accuracy. And that was supposed to make me very confident that the machines were perfect. But it makes me suspicious because I know hand counts aren't perfect. And I would have expected to see discrepancies attributed to hand counting problems documented. They did find 2 interesting discrepancies in the machines. The most interesting one was one where they hypothesized that someone had accidentally put a ballot into the emergency slot on the voting machine, which bypasses the scanner and goes into a special pocket inside the voting machine, which is supposed to hold ballots until the power comes back on or until the scanner is fixed. And that's there because you can't close the polls just because the machine doesn't work. You've got to keep the polls open as long as there are voters who want to vote. I mean, that's a fundamental rule of elections. You open the polls, they're open. And no matter what goes wrong with the machinery, you have to find some way to let the people vote. So every voting machine on the market, every ballot scanner on the market has a pocket in it for emergency use should the scanner stop working. And when the scanner gets fixed or replaced, the election officials take the votes out of that special pocket and put them into the scanner, and they are subject to the usual audit rules and all of that. Well, it turns out that in one polling place, the emergency ballot pocket door had been left open by accident. Some voter must have stuck their ballot in that pocket. The design of the pocket was defective, and the Election Assistance Commission's voting system testing laboratory should have discovered this, because the metal or plastic tab that blocks the end of the pocket had a slot that a ballot could fit through by going into the pocket, jiggling its way out of the pocket and in with the ballots that had already been counted. And that's an example of a failure in the voting system standards enforcement process, but it's also an example of really fun problem for the auditors to figure out why there was one more ballot in the stack that they audited than the number of ballots that the scanner had counted.
Well, finding a mistake made you feel better.
It makes me feel better. It makes me know that the audit is not pointless. It's a real, it is to some extent a real audit. But on the other hand, I'm a little disappointed that they didn't have that they didn't document difficulties in hand counting. They seem to take the machine count as a gold standard and keep fixing their hand count until it matches the machine.
Well, in 2020, what they did here, we had 5 counties, took 5 counties out of the 75.
Right.
And they said, okay, 5 counties, and they told them in advance, we're going to be auditing your county.
Oh, they told them in advance.
Oh yeah, they didn't just show up.
Months in advance.
A month in advance. They did it. So
Okay. Yeah.
So
that's a sham audit.
Okay. So they said, we're going to come in and audit in your county
Yeah.
next month. So then they come in and they go to the election commissioner's office, and they'll have all these boxes of ballots.
Right.
And they go, okay, we'll take that box, that box, that box, that box. They'll get 8 or 10 boxes.
Yeah.
Bring them down, and they say, open them up. They open them up, and they look at the DS200 tape. And it says, okay, in this box, we've got 500 ballots.
There's usually not really 500.
Well,
No. Yeah,
but I'm just
how
getting as an
big
example.
precincts are.
There's 500 ballots in the box. And they'll say, the tape says, the DS200 tape says that there are 450 votes for Trump and 50 for Biden. So then what they do is they count. They go, yep, there's 500 ballots. They count them all and count them. And they go, yep, there are 450 votes for Trump and there were 50 for Biden. We're done with that box. And then they do each box in the same race, Trump race.
Yep.
That's it. And then when that's done, it's 100% accuracy.
Yep.
And they walked away.
Yep.
And they of course then they tell everybody we have done our audits.
Right.
And it's 100% accuracy.
Right. And that's unfortunately typical of the kind of audits that come in counties where they're not used to auditing. The standard they set in California back in 1965 was actually pretty sensible. And it is that after the polls close, after the preliminary count has been announced, precincts are chosen at random for audit. You don't know which precincts. Every county is required to audit, and they choose precincts at random, not knowing what precincts. And then the hand counting team is not told anything about the expected result until they finish the count. And only at the end of their count, they've got a number of ballots and they've got the results for those ballots. Do they compare and say, is this right?
Right.
And that is sort of a minimum rule. The improvement on that's been made in the years since 1965 is an understanding of how many ballots you have to count to get what degree of confidence. And it turns out that depends on the margin in the election. If the election is a landslide, you don't have to look at very many ballots at all to be pretty confident that the count was correct. If the election is a cliffhanger, you basically need a complete hand recount.
Right.
And so the
closer the number, the time of the race, the more ballots you got to count.
Yep. And that's work that really Phil Stark was the pioneer in doing that statistics. It's good to have a statistician on hand.
Oh, absolutely.
But the other thing that's interesting is this whole problem of getting random numbers. How do you pick something at random? And there was a case in Cleveland where the law said they had to pick precincts at random. So on Sunday before the Monday audit, they did machine recounts on a bunch of precincts until they found some precincts that looked good. And then they, quote, selected those ones, unquote, at random. And that's sort of cooking the books, isn't it?
Yeah, I would think so.
In fact, there were some convictions that were overturned on appeal, but there were convictions from that. It's cheating.
Right.
It's cheating because if the audit finds a bug, doesn't that make the election official look bad? And I think that's an area where we have to really push the public relations side of it a little bit. If you've got audits and the audits find a bug, that should be a feather in the cap of the people who did the audit.
Right.
That should be that's praise to the system, because if you find a bug, you have a chance of fixing it. If you sweep the bugs under the rug, you'll never get them fixed.
Right.
Well, then you're infested.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah.
Depends on whether they reproduce.
Well, yeah, that's right. Well, a lot of people are are vested in the system. They have already vouched for it.
Yep.
They've already signed off on election saying everything's good.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to get
Yeah.
those people that
Once
now
you
to,
spent taxpayer money on voting equipment, it's really hard to admit that you might have misspent that money.
right.
And it's really hard to admit that you might be in bed with the vendor, even though you're entirely dependent on them. Because you face it, most of the counties in the United States are small rural counties. There are a few big city counties that have real serious resources. But the small rural counties, you're lucky to find a full-time election person in the county. You'll get a county clerk who during the run-up to the election does elections, but the rest of the year they're selling fishing licenses.
Right.
And under those circumstances, the counties are contracting everything out to election service providers.
Yeah.
And so we're basically
what you call that?
Outsourcing democracy.
Outsourcing democracy. I like that.
Right, right.
That's what we do right here. in our
Right.
state.
I mean, you hire a contractor to print your ballots. You hire a contractor to program your machines. You hire a contractor to do the pre-election testing. So nobody in the county is and the reporting. No one in the county, none of the elected officials in the county are actually responsible for the conduct of the election,
Right.
except that they're signing off on it, and they're sort of in bed with the vendors or in bed with their contractors.
Mhm.
Well, they
And
do LNA tests, we hear.
well, yeah, and
Yeah.
and
That proves it.
and again, this is something. If they didn't do that testing, things would be so much worse.
Yes.
But I've helped Miami-Dade County with LNA testing. I've observed logic and accuracy testing. And it's really important. It turns out it's a well-conducted logic and accuracy test is like a dress rehearsal for a play. You find, but it's too late to find any big errors. You have to, because if you do an LNA test and only then do you discover that you misprinted the ballots or you misdesigned the presentation. The LNA testing is done pretty much the day before you start mailing out absentee ballots to voters.
So it's really designed
If you found that you didn't put some candidate's name on the ballot, you're probably already in the pile of outgoing
we had a
mail.
misspelling in our Senate race.
At least it's a
US Senate
misspelling.
Mhm.
I mean, misspelling, I can vote for someone whose name is spelled wrong, and I can still tell who I'm voting for.
But if he's not on the ballot,
But if he's not on the ballot, that's much worse. And there have been too many cases I've seen where candidates have been left off the ballot. The big problem in Antrim County, Michigan, which is at the heart of so many of this election problems in election 2020,
Right. I remember.
that was they accidentally left a candidate off the ballot in some precincts. So they had those ballots reprinted without reprinting the rest of the ballots. And and they only reprogrammed the machines in the precincts for which they had reprinted the ballots.
Okay.
But it turned out that the election management system needed a consistent view across all the precincts. And the reprinting of the ballots in some of the precincts caused candidate names and numbers to mismatch. So that a vote for Trump was counted as a vote for some presidential candidate among this zoo of minor parties, maybe Biden, but is equally likely communist
Mhm.
or random socialist or green or
independent, whatever.
In Michigan, Upper Peninsula secessionist. Have you heard of the Yoopers? The Yoopers are the secessionists who want the Upper Peninsula to secede from Michigan.
At least they don't want to join Wisconsin.
Oh, no.
That's a whole nother story.
But the thing is,
the LNA test is good for catching unintentional mistakes.
it's good for catching. It could catch all kinds of things, maybe, but to rely on it as proof that you're mistake proof is not right. LNA testing.
What you say earlier, if you wrote a program, right? If you had ever written a program or whatever, you'd write it to where it's over 100 or 200 ballots, whatever, so that it would never catch it on.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I were a crook,
Right.
And how would I go about hacking a voting machine?
By the way, he's not a crook. He's not a crook. Okay.
I am not a crook.
Well,
not a crook.
I when I was consulting with Miami-Dade County, I was asked to consult on the security of their voting system. So I asked many of the people in the election office, I asked them, so if you were a crook, how would you go about corrupting Miami-Dade County's election system? And they all went, yeah, don't ask me that question. I can't possibly, I can't even think about how to corrupt this system. And I said, look, if you're going to defend this system, you have to look at its vulnerabilities, and you have to understand its vulnerabilities. And
like if you're going into
right,
battle.
right. So how do you go about corrupting a voting machine? Well, gee, get a job at Microsoft in the group that's doing the Microsoft embedded system versions that are being built into automobile dashboards and voting machines and things like that, and start doing things that only your quote feature only fires up on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November in an even numbered year. So it only fires up after 50 transactions, because after all, testing usually involves less than 50 ballots. So let's have this feature only enable after it sees 50 transactions. And then the feature starts tinkering with results, and the feature kicks in. And you do this. You don't do this through the election system vendor. You do it through a contractor with a knowledge of how the vendors are using that contractor's tools. In this case, Microsoft, big company. There are probably people following the career path I'm suggesting, working for Microsoft today, working for the Chinese government. I don't know if they're trying to cook elections or whether they're trying to cook automobiles. I mean, when I bought my car, I had to sign a Microsoft end user license agreement to buy my car, because the dashboard is 100% Microsoft software behind that flat panel display.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really happy with that.
Right. I don't blame you. So basically, you would design a program that remains dormant,
yeah,
until it's triggered.
Right.
And there's certain things that could trigger it.
And I only want it to trigger when it's a real election, and not when it's someone doing a little test.
What about the clock in it? You can do like
Yeah,
clock.
yeah. And all these machines are required to timestamp every record, and so that timestamp can be used to determine whether it's time to cheat or not.
Right. Right.
Lots of tools like that.
So this is the reason we at AVII, we'd like to get rid of machines to the extent possible.
Yeah.
Except for the handicap. We know that that's important.
Right.
And we know that has to be
and
used.
the other thing is, simple economics says that in large jurisdictions where you've got thousands of ballots, tens of thousands of ballots, machines really do help you avoid clerical errors. And the trouble is that they're subject to systematic errors. And so the balance point between being vulnerable to clerical errors on the one hand, and being vulnerable and being vulnerable to malicious or erroneous software on the other hand it's a balancing act. And the idea of machine counts with a well-planned campaign of auditing, I think, reaches the happy medium where you get the highest trustworthy rate.
As long as it's a hand-marked ballot.
Yeah.
Hand-marked ballot.
Yeah, hand-marked ballots.
Not a ballot marking device.
Machine-marked ballots, just it cuts. You have to trust the machine, and quite frankly, I'll quote Ronald Reagan quite happily here, saying, "Trust but verify."
Well, James Madison, I think it was said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need laws.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
so to assume that everything is going to be hunky-dory without being able to test
but
it.
I'm not even sure Madison was right, because you can have two well-intentioned people with the best of intentions who reach differing decisions and end up in the most acrimonious fight.
Well, he was just saying we just need laws.
Yeah.
And so that's what's important, because human nature will sink in.
Yep.
And we know that elections have been manipulated and stolen for many, many, many years.
And even when they're not being manipulated and stolen, people have been making clerical errors forever. The moment some clerk in ancient Mesopotamia started doing clerical work in cuneiform on a clay tablet, they were starting to make clerical errors, and they've been doing it ever since. I don't care if it's public or private or corporate or banking or what, wherever people are doing things, they make mistakes. We do it honestly, and those mistakes can be incredibly destructive sometimes.
Yeah, the problem I have is that you're right, but the problem I have is that whether it's intentional or mistake or something
Yeah.
else, it's always characterized as a glitch. It's a computer glitch, and therefore, because it's a computer glitch,
Yep.
no one is held accountable.
Yep.
And that
Right.
is what
We
I've seen more
blame
and
the
more
machine.
of. It's a machine thing.
Yeah, yeah.
and
And
so
then
that's-
the machine predisposes us to these glitches because we don't really control our machines very well.
No, and people
Yeah.
who work in that system like that because now they have something to blame it on. They don't have to be
Yep.
responsible, as opposed to you've got a county that's got 5,000 voters and they get a ballot, maybe 6,000 ballots to
Right.
handle that election. So that has to be
Chain of
controlled, chain
Yeah.
of custody on those 6,000 ballots. You use 5,000, then should be 1,000 left over. And if you don't have that, somebody is responsible.
Yep.
But they don't want that.
So one interesting thing to do is to compare the way we manage our election systems with the way we manage aviation.
Mhm.
In aviation, if there's a problem, it has to be reported to the FAA. And the FAA has not been captured by the vendors. Boeing and Airbus and companies like that have no control over the FAA. And the FAA does real investigations. And I learned this once when I happened to post a note about a flight I was on where the pilot, while sitting on the taxiway, said, "Oops, I'm going to have to reboot the airplane. The power is going to go off. It'll take about 2 minutes. The power will come back on, and we'll see if this fixes the glitch." And I mentioned this in a context where there were some aviation people involved, and the aviation people wanted to know exactly what airplane, exactly when this happened, so they could look up the incident report and tell me what and follow up on it. I would love there to be a system like that with election incidents.
Because almost every time they say it's just the voter error.
Yeah, yeah. And election incidents, I think democracy is important enough that election incidents should be reported. Now, 3 times I worked on Democratic presidential election incident response teams, and I learned from this that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have robust election incident response systems. Each of the parties has precinct level election poll watchers, and those poll watchers, each of them has a phone number in hand for who to phone if there's an incident at their polling place, and they report it up their partisan reporting tree. And so I had access, when I was working for the Democratic Party, to the national database of election incidents. And I even saw an incident in my own home polling place, which was neat because I was working in Obama's Chicago office at the time. And the interesting thing was that database of incidents observed by the Democratic Party was considered party proprietary, secret, do not disclose that this database exists. Now, quite frankly, neither party would be responsible if they weren't doing that, if they weren't tracking the incidents. But the Democratic Party has its incident reporting system. The Republican Party has its incident reporting system. And I sort of learned about that through the back channels, because there are back channels between the incident reporting systems, people who happen to have friends on the other side, and they were phoning each other occasionally. And also because occasionally the incident report said, "I'm reporting this, and my Republican colleague is reporting this too, and we're in complete agreement about this incident, and you guys need to come down hard on the people running this polling place." But the net result is I know these two exist, and I know that in each party, those incident reporting systems are party proprietary information. There's also a public incident reporting system, 1-888 Our Vote. Phone that, and you'll get a bunch of volunteer lawyers and a bunch of volunteer technical people like me who are answering, who are handling their own incident reporting database. But what scared me when I was working for the Democrats was I had access to the 1888-hour vote database, and I also had access to the Democratic Party database, and there was very little overlap. Someone at the polling place phones in an incident report to one of those three. A lawyer or a tech person from one of those three gives advice about what to do about that incident, and that's enough, because most of the time the incidents were not partisan incidents. Most of the times they were just, the voting machine stopped working. What do we do?
Right.
Get them to open up the emergency ballot compartment so you can put your ballots there until the voting machine is fixed, and make sure someone is there when the polls close to make sure that emergency ballot compartment ballots are retrieved and either scanned on the spot or put in a specially marked envelope saying these have not been scanned.
Right.
It's pretty obvious. It's not partisan.
Mm-hmm.
But the lack of overlap scares me.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that two of those databases go into the shred bin as soon as the party decides not to contest the election.
Mm-hmm.
And I want that to be made public. I want that database of all the incidents to be subject to some pretty rigorous analysis post-election. And if you're running a military system, after you have a battle, you have after action reports, and you have and you have serious analysis of what went wrong. We should be doing that with elections. We should view them as that important.
Absolutely.
We shouldn't be shredding the data. We shouldn't be treating it as secret data. Only the Republicans can see this. Only the Democrats can see that.
Right.
I want that data to be public.
Right.
And that's why I stopped doing partisan work and started working for the 1888-hour vote.
Do you think that some election officials don't want that out because oh my gosh, people think we ran a bad election?
Yeah, the parties don't want. They seem to think it's a secret. I mean, it's really obvious if you start thinking about it that a political party ought to be doing this, and that it would be an incompetent political party that wasn't doing this.
Right.
We want our parties to be competent. I want two opposed parties that are competent, so we don't end up with one party rule that just ends up like the old Soviet Union. And I don't care which party it is. Either one poses that risk if they have uncontested power.
Mm-hmm.
I want serious opposition, because that keeps things honest. And I don't want them hiding because we might embarrass one of our elected officials if we disclose the fact that he forgot to program this voting machine in this precinct or something. I mean, give me a break.
Right.
But we should reward people who self-report and say, "Hey, I'm glad you found this and you know."
Yeah, and it shouldn't be when finding a bug should not be considered evidence of crime.
Right.
Yeah, it should be
our goal is to have a very transparent election that people can have faith and confidence in, no matter whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, and everybody's vote should count. Right. But and we'll go ahead in just a minute. But I got something I want to bring up. I've seen several ways of counting. Linda Rance has her system up in Missouri. They have the clothesline method. They've got Mark Cook has got his method there in Texas. But you brought up one earlier that we talked about that I'd like for you to let people know about. The one where, well, go ahead and explain.
So you're right. There's an election integrity group that's headquartered in Dane County, Wisconsin, which is where Madison is. And they came up with a rather clever way to do a hand count. What they do is they take an overhead projector, which allows them to project the ballots on a big screen. And one person is just shuffling ballots into the projector and shuffling them in again and again and again, putting the ballots on the big screen. And for each ballot, members of the audience have these clickers like they use to take inventory in grocery stores, where you click it and it just advances a little counter in the clicker. And so you've got, say, two people counting Democratic presidential votes, two people counting Republican presidential votes, maybe two people counting Green Party, and always by at least two, because you want to be able to notice your own mistakes. And if you have two people independently counting candidates. So as the ballots go by, you click your clicker every time you see the candidate you're in charge of counting. And you could handle a ballot every 2 seconds or so. And with a room full of people, you could count all the races on that face of the ballot. And with multiple people counting each race. And at the end of the stack, you would compare your counts. And if you found some discrepancies, you redo the whole stack. But working through this Dane County Election Integrity Group was FOIA-ing all the ballots after each election in Dane County. The election office thought they were the enemy and was really pushing back against this until it had been going on for a few years. And then the election office began to realize these people are our friends.
Mm-hmm.
They are finding our mistakes, forcing us to correct them. And they are, when we aren't making mistakes, they're offering tremendous reassurance in the correctness of the vote.
Right.
And so that they then, when the 2016 race in Wisconsin was being contested, and there was a statewide recount, some counties agreed to do a hand count. Some counties did machine counts, but this Dane County Election Integrity Group spread out and got volunteers, Republicans and Democrats, to use their right as observers to ask that each ballot be shown to them before it was run through the counting machine. And so they, in several of the counties that did machine recounts, they did volunteer hand counts using the clicker method on the ballots that were being machine counted, and offered, I think, significant reassurance that those machine counts were correct.
Just to make sure I got
Found
it
a
right.
few mistakes too, but
Well, just so I got it right, so the people listening can understand.
Yeah.
So let's just say you had a race. You had 5 races.
Yeah.
And you had a Democrat and Republican running in each race.
Yep.
So Democrat, Republican, race 1, race 2, race 3, race 4. So you got 5.
Yep.
And so then what you would have is 10 people.
Right.
And 10 people. So you'd have 2 people in the first race, one clicking for the Republican and one clicking for the Democrat.
Well, ideally, you'd have 20 people, because
20.
you really want to, you want some way to detect if you've made mistakes. And if you're if you're misclicking,
Right.
you want to find out. And one way to help you find out is to have more people on each
Well,
candidate.
you could always have another person,
Right.
and every 10 put a slash.
Yep.
And so then you
Yep.
know that if you made a mistake, it's in the last 10.
Yep. So
And then I think that's great. But also you said you could have it projected on the wall, and so you can have somebody recording that.
right.
And
we could be
so
every
every
ballot
ballot.
to coin vote streaming.
Yep.
Yeah, and
Yep.
every vote would be seen, so anybody could watch the video
Yep.
and do it themselves.
Yep.
So you have total confidence, total
Right. It ends up
transparency.
It ends up being, and I think, look, in the current political situation, if you look at the U.S. population as a whole, something like 2/3 of all Republicans are still suspicious of election 2020, and that, given the number of independents, that's probably what 20% of the U.S. population is really suspicious of election 2020, and it's more than 2 years ago. Under those circumstances, in order to build confidence in our voting system, we owe the electorate really radical transparency. We owe
Right.
the electorate a system which isn't based on a demand from an election official saying, you've just got to trust me. I've tested these machines. Look, my testing must be good because it met the requirements of the law. These machines have these big, beautiful EAC certification forms that makes them trustworthy. Just trust us, please. That doesn't work.
No,
That doesn't work in the current political climate. We owe the U.S. population as a whole. We owe the electorate transparency at a level where everyone can be confident that the system really is honest.
Right.
And if it's not honest, I want to know and I want it fixed.
I do too.
No matter what party you are, we want your vote to count.
Right.
And we want you to vote, and we want it to count.
Right.
But when we talk about the recounts and the audits, the purpose of those also is not really to see if it's 100% match. It's that the right people were elected.
Yeah. Well, this is Stark's invention that if you want assurance that the election elected the right people, that is to say that the declared outcome matches the will of the electorate. If that's the assurance you want, you can do it by counting a relatively small number of ballots. If you other kinds of audits will detect other problems. I mean, there's the complete recount where we reconcile every ballot against its machine interpretation, and there we're looking for strange borderline cases in the counting of votes. Probably won't matter in the outcome, but they're all different. One thing about audits is you have to figure out what you're auditing for.
Mhm.
Are you auditing for correct election outcome, or are you auditing for process? That is to say, are you trying to identify incompetence? That's a different kind of auditing. Are you attempting to identify fraud? Well, there could be fraud that didn't affect the outcome, and we wouldn't detect that if our audit was primarily focused on the outcome, because they're, the fraudsters who fail to change the outcome are, it's still fraud.
It's still fraud.
It's
Right.
still, you should still convict them if you catch them.
Mhm.
But it's failed fraud, but still failed fraud is still fraud.
Yeah.
And when the Dr. Stark and actually Dr. Appel, they said you need to do these audits before certification if your audit is to prove that
Right.
the right people
Right.
were elected.
So this,
And you need to do all
Right.
races.
so process auditing you can do later.
Yeah.
There's continuous, what's the buzzword? I love buzzwords. Continuous process improvement auditing is where you're trying to figure out what did we do wrong so we can do better next time.
Which is
And that you can do after you've certified the results.
Well, I don't know if we told you this, but in Arkansas, we've never done a primary. We've never audited a primary.
Hmm.
Ever.
Oh, really?
Ever.
Okay.
Okay. That's a problem. That's a problem. That's a problem because,
Well, actually,
we're a
the
solid
elect-
red state.
Yeah.
And
Primaries are really what matters in that
that's
case.
it, because
Yeah.
whoever wins the primary is going to be the next congressman, senator,
Right.
or whatever.
And-
But they don't do them.
Well, in fact, a lot of election law is not oriented towards primaries. So, for example, who's allowed to be an observer at a count or a recount? Each party is allowed to nominate its observers.
Mhm.
So you can have a Democrat and a Republican poll watcher. So at the primary, what about the Republican establishment versus the Republican upstart? Shouldn't the upstart have an opportunity to contest the actions of the establishment?
Yeah.
Our rules for who's entitled to observe are really not set up for primaries. And I think we really need to rethink some of that because, well, I was brought into a case in Arizona by a Republican upstart running against the local establishment. And it was, he had interesting complaints about the fact that the party was entitled to a representative at the recount for the primary, but he wasn't.
Right.
He's not part of the party. Right?
Well,
The
he's
insider or-
he's a registered Republican. He was just this was back during the period when people talked about neocons,
Mhm.
and he was part of the neocon and Tea Party insurgency back in that era.
Uh-huh.
And it was an insurgency against the old country club set, which used to run the party.
Mhm.
And it was really interesting trying to get my hands on the ballots and find out what had actually happened.
Well,
We did come up with conclusions about what might have happened, but we never got our hands on the ballot.
and
Yeah.
here it's very, very hard here.
Yeah.
Again, that's one of the excuses that is always given. Well, yeah, but we always have the ballots. You can always count the ballots later.
The barcodes don't
The
matter.
barcodes don't matter because you can always count
Right.
them all, but you never
Right.
count them because
Right.
you can't get access to them
Right. And
because you got a court order.
it's a real puzzle because the question, are ballots subject to FOIA, is something that varies from state to state.
Mhm.
In Wisconsin, this integrity group in Madison was able to FOIA the ballots. In Florida sunshine law allowed them to FOIA the ballots, but they couldn't touch them. So a county election department employee would have to pick up each ballot and hold it up against the glass window, and then put it down and pick up another one and hold it against the glass window. But that's how they did the newspaper-funded recounts of Florida 2000. But Florida's FOIA is a pretty good law, or at least was then. It might be subject to the same challenges that people are getting around the country today.
Right here in Arkansas.
Yeah,
We're
well,
getting huge
we're
challenges right here.
facing those challenges in Iowa too.
Right.
It seems to be a coordinated campaign from somewhere to
remove transparency
to remove transparency. Yeah.
in
Right.
voting and in government.
Well, yeah,
Just
I
saying.
really would like, who's paying for these airplane trips the governor is taking. It would be nice to know.
And who's on the plane with it?
Right.
Yeah.
I got you. Well, thanks a lot for coming in and sharing
Okay.
your thoughts with us. It's been great. Do you have anything else,
Yeah.
Will?
Real fast. Let's go back, like trying to remember the court. There were some times where the judge was saying something, you were shaking your head. Like, that's not right.
Well, yeah, I was.
Like
Y'all were behind me, so I didn't see that.
So it was
So
like, this is inaccurate. This is inaccurate. Do you remember what?
Oh gosh, I just remember that there were points where he was saying, I think quite correctly, that we needed to keep the case narrow.
Mhm.
And that we needed to focus on the question on this single narrow legal question. I think he was entirely correct in that.
Mhm.
But he was also, and then the lawyer kept saying, I have these experts who can testify about the vulnerability of the machines. And some of my head shaking was, I wish that he would, don't follow that path. That's a path the judge has already blocked off, and I think correctly so.
Mhm.
And so some of that was head shaking, but I was also, do you have anyone who can testify about some of these things? He wasn't paying attention. He doesn't have eyes in the back of his head.
Yeah.
He didn't know that Phil and I were at several points in there. Yes, we could testify of these things.
Yeah.
Right.
But the judge was saying, then he goes,
Yeah.
unless only if it's been in Arkansas.
Right. And that was that. I think he was the judge. This is where I think the judge made a mistake. That saying you have to prove that there was fraud before you can do it is
Shouldn't it be the other way around with voting machines?
Yeah. Well, I remember catch-22s in elections are so common. I mean, in Florida, they had this rule that you could do a you had to use a machine recount. You could not do a hand recount unless you could prove that there'd been a miscount.
Right.
But how do you prove that there's a miscount?
If there hasn't been a.
How do you, I mean, it just,
Well, I've seen it where
if you could prove that the machine was broken, then you could do a hand recount. But if the machine's broken was in its tabulation, then how do you prove it without being able to look at the ballots?
I think that's intentional, and I think they
I
know
think
it.
so too.
It's absolutely intentional.
I think that was an example which we just don't want people going there.
That's right. And in fact, in Nebraska back in the late 90s, that's where I first saw where they brought it up. Well, if you do a recount, if we do one, it has to be in the same method as it was originally counted. Which means you got to run them back to the machine.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to hand score.
Colorado recount law used to work that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't now, but it used to work that way, that the recount was to be done using the same tabulating technology as used for the first count, which means that a recount could not correct any problems in the tabulating
And as
technology.
Dr. Stark says, it's like going to the same doctor for a second opinion.
Yeah.
You're going to the exact same doctor.
Right.
Tell me again.
Right.
Some of your head shaking too, I saw was when the judge was saying, well, you can review this on the screen. You get to review it.
Right. And he was violating his own rule, that his own eventual ruling, that what happens on the screen is not the ballot. The ballot is that piece of paper.
Yeah.
That the law is about that piece of paper. The law says that the voter must be able to verify what's on that piece of paper.
Before tabulation,
Right.
He established
And he at the
casting.
Yeah, at the very end of the hearing, he conceded those points, but they didn't seem to be.
I'm not sure he quite grasped that the barcode is the vote.
Well, yeah, and that if I can verify part of the ballot but not the other part, doesn't that?
But he wasn't.
Yeah.
He understood it.
Yeah.
Tabulated the barcode.
Right.
But not. He didn't quite put it together. The vote.
Well,
is
right, and
the
this
barcode.
is why he was anxious to end that hearing. You can tell it. He was just going to end that
Well,
hearing.
he announced that at the beginning.
But he also made these concessions towards the end that I think logically contradict his conclusion. And I'm not sure he followed through on that.
Well,
Right,
you
I
kind of
agree.
touched on a little. How will that clarification that this is a ballot, this is what's counted, all that? How will that help other people around the country who are looking for election
Well,
security?
we have to remember that elections are state
State by
and
state?
state-
Yeah.
the unwillingness of states to care about what happens in other states
As we
is-
saw also.
is quite curious, because yes, Arkansas law is Arkansas law and Iowa law is Iowa law, and they are not the same. But boy, do they have huge parallels between each other.
Especially when they're copied and
Because
pasted from
yeah, I
Iowa.
mean, we have legislatures that actually legislators from different states talk to each other, and they get together and they write model
Wasn't that one of your
legislation.
chapters
Isn't it ALEC, Association of Legislators? or
Yeah,
something like that?
ALEC is
Yeah.
an example. But I mean, I think this is a quote from one of the books on voting machine regulation. I forget which book it was. It might have been the California Secretary of State's History of Election Technology. That was a wonderful quote. Most states' election laws follow closely on New York law, probably because they were copied from it.
Chapter 6 in your book talks about how a lot of the legislation is copied and pasted. Like, I like that part. I like that part.
Yeah,
I like that
yeah.
part. They just copied and pasted. But then a lot of those don't go together when you're way down the law.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is what happens when you do collage.
Yeah, it's like the images when you cut the eyes out of the magazine, the chin out of a different magazine,
Yeah.
the hair.
You realize, of course, that you're off camera.
Yeah.
Yes. That's okay. That's all right.
Everybody gets to hear that.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
But yeah, so chapter 6 of the book. Broken ballots.
Yeah.
Dr. Jones here.
Uh,
And so, well, I just out of the hearing today, it was frustrating.
Very
They
Yeah.
wouldn't let our experts even explain. I understood his logic. He conceded that we can't read barcodes. The next machine only reads barcodes, but the law says verify your vote, and you get to verify some names on a piece of paper. So for him, the intent of the law was the voters get to look at something.
Yeah, that amounts to it. But it's the sad thing is that these are all arguments that I remember having over dinner with the inventor of the Populex voting system back in 73 or 4. And none of the arguments have changed. It's the same argument. And he got that system through the certification process. He sold to one county in Missouri, as far as I can tell.
Mhm.
He had a lot of money to throw away because he invented several things that paid very well, and that allowed him to invent his election thing.
Got it. But that is the system. Ours is very similar, if not almost exactly the one that was.
Sanford Morgenstein's patents expired before ES&S came to market with the express vote.
Okay, all right. Because they were AIS before.
Yeah.
And then
That's it. The AIS, that's ancient history.
Yes.
The express vote is what, 2016? When was it introduced?
I think 2016 in Arkansas.
Yeah.
2018.
Well, it might be 2016 or even 2014, in that era.
They had the Avotronics before.
And it's, if you look at the date on you get 7 years on your patent, and then it expires. And Sanford Morgenstein patented his Populex system in around 2002 to 4. I forget exactly. It's
then it becomes public
and
domain.
then it becomes public domain 7 years after that.
Our evidence today we entered was a 2016 ballot summary card.
Right.
So that was express vote.
Right.
So ballot summary.
Right. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, but I think we didn't get them.
Not all counties.
Yeah.
And I evaluated the express vote for Scott County, Iowa, back in around 2018.
Okay.
For handicapped use only, but
even Dr. Stark said, who's on the EAC advisory board,
right now, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Said it was a shock that they were pushing them out, these ballot marketing devices for everybody.
Yep.
To be used. That's not what they.
But the accessibility community has real. I mean, face it. If you're blind, if you're physically disabled, you really do have a right to vote. And the accessibility community,
Privately.
yeah,
Right.
the accessibility community wants technology that allows blind people and people with major physical disabilities to be able to vote. And I agree with them. I'm perfectly happy
100%.
to stand up for their right for that. And I certainly don't want them to have to rely on someone they don't trust to fiddle with their ballot. And so that community says, we really want one technology that meets the needs of all voters. And that really pushes us towards these universal use of ballot marking devices so that the blind voter isn't singled out for using a blind-only voting machine. And the physically disabled voter who can't hold a pen isn't singled out for using a voting machine that they can use using some kind of sip and puff mouthpiece or something. They've got a point.
Mhm.
And there are ballot marking devices which meet their needs pretty well, but they're a little expensive, and your average precinct doesn't have one. And the idea of universal accessibility says that every precinct should be equipped, whether or not there's a voter who wants it. That gets expensive.
True.
So your universal ballot marking devices sort of sweep that problem under the rug by saying, let's all use the same expensive technology.
Right. It's all about more machines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it looks awful good on the bottom line for the voting machine companies.
Very good. But we don't know because we're not allowed to see their finances.
No, and a lot of them are privately held, right?
Well, all of them that I know of. I mean,
Yeah.
the Hard Civic, the big ones,
Yeah.
Hard Civic and Dominion and
Yeah.
ES&S. And so we're not allowed to know how much they make.
Senators
Right.
Warren and Klobuchar brought up the secret ownership and the unknown amount.
Yeah,
The report,
yeah.
Was it 19 or 18 they did the report?
Well, and we've got some delightfully complicated corporate law in this country that allows delightfully hidden ownership.
But that should be allowed in
Corporate will.
elections.
Well, yeah, and well,
It should not be.
yeah, it shouldn't be. But
No.
but just think of so many other places. I mean,
Yeah.
if you want to make a donation to a political party, you have to be a U.S. citizen. But if you want to make a donation to a PAC that's deeply involved in politics, you can be a foreign corporation. As long as it's a corporation, corporations seem to have no citizenship requirement, and that's funny.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know where to draw the line for how much percent foreign owned is a problem. But right now, the current Citizens United seems to give corporations greater rights to participate in the public sphere than
Mhm.
people, because I have to be a citizen if I'm going to contribute to a party. But
Yeah, but the corporate does.
yeah,
You
that's a
know,
little weird.
I don't know if you pay attention to politics itself, but a lot of the arguments I remember hearing in the early 2000s about corporations controlling the narrative in elections, war, these kind of things, they've moved from being the far left to the far right now, where we're hearing the exact same
Yeah, well,
arguments.
and the argument wasn't wrong.
No, but we're hearing it now on
Yeah,
both
yeah,
sides.
yeah.
Well,
And it used to be, post 2000, the assumption was if you were questioning the integrity of elections, you were questioning the legitimacy of the Bush presidency, and therefore you were probably a Democrat.
Well, we had the
And
Diebold
now,
thing. In
yeah, the
Ohio.
Diebold, that was all
We'll
taken.
deliver Ohio.
Right. Well, that was just dumb on the part of that particular corporate officer.
yeah.
He should have been.
He left.
He should have understood that when you buy a voting system company, you also buy a certain liability for political involvement.
Yep.
That you really shouldn't be so dumb as to endorse candidates. Of course, Microsoft was doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft was betting on the outcome of the 2000 presidential election, and hoping that would end the cloud of antitrust activity against them, and it did.
Mm-hmm.
But at one point, I remember Microsoft had just claimed that Microsoft Windows is a is a single integrated system. You cannot remove Internet Explorer from Windows. They are one and the same. It's an integrated system. You couldn't possibly break us up and make us spin off a separate unit to do Internet Explorer. So at that point, yes, no, it was Global Election Systems, soon to become Diebold, that was appearing before the Iowa Board of Examiners. And Bob Urosevich, the president, was there. And I said, Microsoft just declared in court that Windows is a unified thing. So do you have Internet Explorer as part of your voting machine since it's Windows based? And he said, no, we stripped that out. And I said to him, so what does that mean about what Microsoft said in court? And he said, they're lying.
Which is funny because now nobody uses Explorer. I think it was actually retired recently, right?
Yeah. Well, but
But
nonetheless,
but the discourse
to have someone like Bob Urosevich, who's a super salesman, and I'm not sure I'd trust him farther than I could throw him. To have him say outright they're lying was really rather fun.
Well, people don't know who Bob Urosevich is.
Okay, Bob Urosevich is one of the two founding brothers of election systems and software. The Urosevich brothers founded it. Bob was a voting system salesman, and his brother was an IBM, a printing house salesman. He sold ballot printing among other products, and his brother was an IBM rep. And they had this idea for using test technology to count ballots.
Like the SAT.
Yeah, exactly.
Pencil.
They came to Westinghouse Learning Corporation, which built the scanners for scanning the ACT exam. And they said, could your scanners be used to count ballots? And that led to the construction of the Westinghouse ballot counting system, which lasted for about 2 years. And then they spun off American Information Systems from that to become what grew into election systems and software. So in any case,
in Nebraska,
Bob Urosevich had this idea for a vote anywhere model where he was going to put direct recording electronic voting machines in kiosks in shopping malls, and you'd come up to the kiosk with your smart card voter card, stick it in the kiosk, and it would present you with your ballot. So you could have convenience voting in supermarkets and shopping malls and everywhere with these little kiosks. Cute idea. So he quit ES&S and went to this new company called IMARC Election Systems, which became Global Election Systems, which became Diebold Election Systems, which became Premier Election Systems, which the ashes of which were consumed mostly by Dominion.
Yep.
But founded this new company to build this kiosk system, which evolved into the Diebold touchscreen voting machine, the AccuVote touchscreen machine.
Right.
And it was a cute idea, but it had its weaknesses.
He also became the CEO of Seidel.
Yeah, that was later, right? And Seidel is a big Spanish voting
Yep.
machine company actually it's a big Spanish tech company that, among other things, was trying to get into the voting machine market, which is not a big market anywhere but the United States. Because India is 100% voting machines and Brazil is 100% voting machines. But those are very different from the machines used in the United States.
Yeah, there's no evidence of.
And Seidel, of course, is based out of Spain.
Right.
And Seidel owns Clarity.
Yeah.
And Clarity is who we send all of our results to here in Arkansas.
Oh,
we use Clarity.
okay.
And so if you were to go to our Secretary of State's website, and you go to type in the URL for past elections, you'll see Clarity elections.
Right. And it's this is a classic outsourcing game.
Our whole election is outsourced.
Right.
Reporting.
But the reporting is, all the official reporting as opposed to the unofficial reporting. The official reporting still happens with a huge amount of paper and a huge amount of old-fashioned gumshoe work.
Right.
And
that's the good thing about Arkansas elections is We take those
Right,
DS200
Right.
tapes, we do all that, compare it to what was
Right.
recorded.
right,
So
Yeah,
if there
that-
were
that-
any glitches
that-
or anything,
For
that-
us, since we don't have
right. So
boxes, mailbox, we
you have
don't
to
have
you
that
have to
problem.
really distinguish between the unofficial early reports, which are hugely outsourced, and the final report of canvass, which is almost always a great big spreadsheet done on paper with ink and hand carried by someone driving from the county to the Secretary of State's office. I've never done that with official county results. I've done it with caucus results,
Uh-huh.
but it is sort of fun driving to Des Moines with a trunkload of caucus results.
Yeah, they don't do that here. Everything, they don't do that here.
Right. Well, caucuses are a purely party game, and they're a hoot. But Iowa's caucuses got too big for their own good, and Democratic Party's trying to kill the Democratic caucuses. The Republican Party is still proud of the Republican caucuses, but it's when the caucus attendance. Caucus is supposed to be a little small group and meeting in someone's living room and arguing. When you got 620 people in trying to attend one caucus, it's a zoo, and it doesn't really work.
Who are the people they are representing at the caucus?
The caucus is the precinct.
Okay.
So it's voters from that precinct converging in person to conduct precinct level party business, including nominating and including electing representatives to the county political convention. And Democrats and Republicans in each county have their own political conventions. And the county political conventions elect delegates to the state and congressional district political conventions. And the state and congressional district political conventions elect delegates to the national conventions. So when you're electing delegates to the county convention, you're electing the people who will elect delegates to the state and district conventions, who will elect the national delegates.
Got it.
And so by doing that, you're determining the delegates really indirectly. But if you're going first, you really want people to be able to change their mind. So in fact, no one's locked in by that. Instead, what you're electing people who will elect people who will elect people. And they're divided up by presidential preference group. But if that candidate drops out, they become free delegates who are free to vote for whoever they want. And when you consider the fact that most of the candidates have dropped out by the time the state convention occurs, you really want that flexibility. So, and both the Republican and Democratic parties build that kind of flexibility in. I'm really bothered by the idea of an early primary in January or February, where you lock people in to vote for a dead candidate by the time the national convention comes around. I'm as bothered by that as I am by the idea of Super Tuesday, where you could lock in the nomination before half the country has voted.
Right. I liked your idea before. Why don't you tell our audience about that?
If I were designing, give me a chance to design the primary system. Oh boy,
design it.
Fat chance. But give me a chance, and I'd say that whatever states have the last primary of primary season should elect half the delegates. So take states representing half the population, probably the big states, California, New York, Texas. Let them go last.
Super Tuesday would be
they get the final say.
Mm-hmm.
And then take mid-sized states and put them a month earlier and elect a quarter of the delegates. And then take little states and put them a month earlier and elect an eighth of the delegate. And then some of the small states, jurisdictions that are small enough that you can do real retail politics, let them go first, so that candidates can dip their toes in retail politics. And if they pull it off in an early state, they can use that to build some fundraising and to build momentum to do the campaigning it takes to take on mid-sized states and mid-sized numbers of delegates. And people who pull that off can build momentum, build campaign, build attract volunteers and attract the money it takes to run in the big states at the end.
Mhm.
But I think that would give a chance to the candidates who are coming out of left field, because we've had some good presidents come out of left field. We've also had some crazy ones come out of left field
Mhm.
historically, but we want candidates to be able to build a reputation and let them start someplace small, but let them work their way up. And I'm perfectly happy. I sort of fun always being first, like we were in Iowa for a while, but I'd be perfectly happy to trade the honor of going first on some kind of a lottery system with other states. But the idea that Iowa and New Hampshire should always be first, that's perhaps a little silly.
Mhm.
Although I for a long time, I was fairly good friends with the Secretary of State in New Hampshire, and he certainly didn't think it was silly.
So for you, you would have a stepped
Yeah.
percentage of a primary, but also you wouldn't have ballots with 29 races on it. You'd rather see
Well,
election day for federal on one,
Well,
and local in a different
this
election day.
is, you could do that. I mean, I've actually spoken to U.S. diplomats who are involved in attempting to export democracy to the third world, where there are some countries that are sort of teetering on the edge
Where
of
there's oil.
dictatorship. And some of them have said, don't tell people this, but when we tell people they ought to consider a more democratic election system, we tend to say, do it the way Canada does it. Because the way Canada does it is with separate election day for federal office, separate election day for provincial office, and separate election day for local office. And by doing it the way Canada does it, you don't have these, you can let the Federal Election Commission run federal elections nationwide. You can let the state election office run state elections statewide, and you can let the city election office run city elections citywide. And that seems to require a lot of duplication, but it may actually simplify things a lot.
Right.
But
It's easier for a voter.
yeah. And it's also easy to follow the races if you don't have to follow a race for county mosquito abatement district at the same time you're following the race for president.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, we appreciate you coming on. And
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right.
It's been just a joy. So,
Okay.
and you're more than welcome. I'd love to have you back.
Well, I've enjoyed my visit.
And hopefully we'll get some resolution on this, and we'll go to the Supreme Court and Arkansas Supreme Court and see what they have to say.
Well,
and but I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right. Good deal.
Say bye to.
See y'all.
Goodbye.
Take care.